Welcome to She is Resilient, a podcast for women on their healing journeys who are ready to start living their most authentic and empowered lives outside of survival mode. I'm your host, Tatiana, trauma and somatic therapist, as well as a holistic coach, and I'm on a mission to help more women heal their nervous systems. Each week, me and my guests are going to get real and vulnerable about the experiences that led us to becoming the empowered and resilient women we are today. You'll leave this podcast with the skills, knowledge, and inspiration to start creating the life you deserve. Because if another woman can do it, so can you. Welcome back to another episode of She is Resilient. Today we're talking about how the survival states fight, flight, and freeze show up in your life and what your life says about your nervous system. Because here's the thing, everything in your life is a direct reflection of the state of your nervous system. Literally everything. Your thoughts, emotions, sensations, behaviors, physical symptoms, lifestyle, everything. So when you start to understand your nervous system and start to heal your nervous system, your life will be entirely different. You will be able to live your most fulfilling life once you have a more resilient and flexible nervous system. I can guarantee you that. Your life shouldn't only feel good when you're on vacation. And if it does only feel good when you're on vacation, then that's a sign that you need to change your lifestyle so that you can enjoy your life and not feel like you need a vacation every month. So as you're listening to this, I invite you to reflect on where in your life these survival states are showing up for you so that you can begin to bring more awareness to these states or to these areas that need support. So let's dive in. Let's start with the fight response. When you're in a state of fight, and also before I continue, I just want to say that you don't need to be experiencing all of these signs and symptoms, but if you're experiencing any of these signs or symptoms, it's a good indicator that you're in a state of fight. So you may be experiencing anger, frustration, irritability, defensiveness, or being very reactive, stubborn, resistant to doing things or trying new things. You might also be judgmental of yourself, judgmental of others. You may engage in road rage. You might be critical of yourself or others. You might have feelings of wanting to scream or punch or kick something. And when you're in a state of fight, you might also have thoughts like, I hate everyone, or I hate people, or I don't need anyone. That's a really common one, right? I don't need anyone. So this is where guardedness lives. So if you've ever met someone who's really guarded or overprotective of themselves or others, this is a sign that they're in a state of fight. And I know that this was definitely me in my teenage years. And then again, when I was in grad school, I was very guarded. I felt like I couldn't trust anyone. And so that's another sign, having difficulty trusting others. And I know that sometimes this can be confusing because some people might associate inability to trust with fear or anxiety. And that could be the case for some people. But lack of trust, usually when we get to the root of it, is a sign of protection, which falls under the fight state. Okay, so some other signs of fight are having mean or aggressive thoughts. Even if you're not acting on any of these thoughts, they still reflect a state of fight. And I really want you to understand this piece because it's not just about expressing these feelings of anger or aggression. It's about the internal experience. So even if externally you're presenting very differently, you could very much still be in a state of fight. So some physical signs of the fight state are burning sensations, clenched jaw, TMJ, clenched fists, and muscle tension throughout the body. So I think I pretty much covered most of the common ways that the fight response shows up. And I'm sure every single one of us has been in this state at some point, right? Because we're all human and we will experience any one of these responses again at another point in our lives. But the goal is to not stay stuck in this state, right? Because a healed nervous system is a nervous system that has flexibility, where it can go into these states of activation but not get stuck here for days, weeks, months, or even years. And if you do get stuck in this state for a long period of time, or if you're experiencing some of these symptoms most days than not, then that's a good sign that your nervous system is functioning from a state of fight. Okay, so let's move on to the flight state. So this is where anxiety lives over worrying, racing thoughts, intrusive thoughts, obsessive thoughts. Any thought related to fear, anxiety, or worry lives in the flight state. Over intellectualizing is also a sign of flight. So if you tend to be a logical or an analytical thinker where you need to make sense of everything or find the answer to everything, then there's a high chance that you're in a state of flight. This is also where avoidance lives, perfectionism lives, hustle culture, always needing to be on the go, inability to slow down or rest. And along with that, if you're a fast talker, that's also a good sign that you're in a state of flight, right? So fast is sympathetic activation, fight or flight, and slow is parasympathetic activation, which is where you can rest and feel settled and at ease. And as I say that, I'm thinking about how this episode is really helpful, not only to understand yourself, but also to understand others when you're interacting with them. One thing that I hear a lot of my clients say is that healing is a double-edged sword, because once you start healing, you also start noticing the people around you who aren't healed, and you truly do start to outgrow relationships. On the flip side, understanding how a nervous system works, whether it's yours or others, can also help you have more empathy for others, especially with the people that you love. So when you're interacting with someone that you care about and you can understand what's happening in their nervous system, especially if you're in an argument or in a place where it's difficult for you to have that empathy, understanding what's happening in their nervous system or just understanding how a nervous system works can really help you access some of that empathy. All right, so some other signs of flight are needing to have control over everything, hating surprises, being rigid, taking everything very seriously, having long to-do lists and doing things just to cross them off your list, not because you really want to do them, but just because you need to cross them off your list. And obviously there's an exception for some things, right? Like if it's work related where it's required, but if it makes sense for you to want to cross them off your list. But if you're noticing that this is the way that you are with other things unrelated to work, then that's a sign that you're in a state of flight, right? So for example, if you meditate or if you go to the gym just to check it off your list versus doing it because you're listening to what your body needs that day, then that's a good sign that you're in the state of flight, right? Whenever you're in these survival states, fight, flight, or freeze, you are disconnected from your body. Even when you're doing something like meditating or going to the gym, you can still be disconnected from your body. All right, so some other examples of flight are overreacting to things that most people would find minor, inability to take healthy risks, becoming overstimulated easily with sounds or light, for example, and struggling to focus or concentrate. Some physical or behavioral symptoms that tell you that you're in a state of flight are racing heartbeat, feeling like your heart is pounding, having a knot in your throat or stomach, constriction in your chest, fast breathing, high blood pressure, feeling restless, feeling like you're on the lookout all the time, or feeling like you're on the edge. So, for example, like when people say they feel paranoid, the appropriate term for that is hypervigilance, not paranoid. The term paranoid should only be used when someone is experiencing paranoia, which is part of psychosis. And 9 times out of 10, when people say that they feel paranoid, they don't actually mean paranoid. They actually mean hypervigilance. So, if you're hearing this differentiation for the first time, I invite you to practice using the word hypervigilance instead of paranoid, and even take it a step further and gently correct others who misuse the word paranoid. It's also kind of like the word bipolar, right? Like, you should only really use that word if you're truly talking about a bipolar diagnosis, as opposed to using it when you mean that something or someone is hot and cold. I feel like that's another episode for another time, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but I just wanted to point that out. If you do feel like you're on the edge or feel like you're on the lookout, the appropriate term is hypervigilance. So, some other signs of flight are having a hard time sleeping, shakiness throughout the body, feeling fidgety all the time. For example, a common one is having cricket leg. So, if you have cricket leg, that's a good sign of the flight state. Other signs are chronic pain, unexplained aches or soreness, or unexplained itching, and lastly, getting flustered easily. And again, I'm sure that there are so many other tiny behaviors, sensations, and thoughts that I could go into, but these signs are typically the ones that I see the most when I'm working with the women in my practice. So, alrighty, let's see. Let's talk about the freeze response. So, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that all of the survival responses are sort of like a spectrum. So, there are mild symptoms and then there are more severe symptoms. So, like I mentioned earlier, we're all going to experience some of these signs or symptoms at some point in our lives, whether they're more mild or severe. Okay, so some signs of freeze are feeling stuck, whether that's physically or emotionally, for example. So, physically would be feeling like you can't move when you want to, and emotionally would be feeling stuck in life. So, feeling like you're not satisfied with where you are in your career or in your personal life, and maybe you feel like you want to do more, but you can't get yourself to do it. So, for example, if you wanted to start your own business but couldn't get yourself to do it, that would be a sign of freeze. If you wanted to show up more on social media, for example, and you can't, that would also be a sign of freeze. If you wanted to go for a promotion at work but feel like you can't go for that promotion, you can't get yourself to do it or apply or whatever it is, that's also a sign of freeze, feeling stuck. Another example of this would be wanting to complete smaller tasks, like wanting to do the laundry or make yourself a meal, but you can't physically get yourself up to do it. Other examples are feeling disconnected from your body, feeling physically or emotionally numb, feeling like you're in a dream, having brain fog, feeling like you can't recognize yourself in the mirror, or maybe like your body parts aren't yours, This is also where depression lives, burnout, low self esteem, low self confidence, comparing yourself to others, feeling hopeless, unworthiness, inability to set boundaries, feeling like you're too much or can't take up space, feelings of wanting to hide or collapse, experiencing shame, grief, sadness, feelings of emptiness, wanting to make yourself small, thoughts like, I can't do this or I don't deserve this, sort of like when we were talking about applying for a promotion, for example, right? Another thought that you might have is, I want to, but I can't. So, all of those are signs of freeze. And I mentioned a few physical symptoms already, like feeling numb and empty, but some other ones are feeling heaviness, irritable bowel syndrome, which is actually a sign that both your flight and your freeze response are being activated at once. So if you experience IBS, that's both sympathetic activation, flight, and freeze. And some last few signs are having a high tolerance for pain, having cold hands or feet all of the time, and lack of hunger cues. And also, speaking of cold hands and feet, I actually forgot to mention that having clammy hands is also a sign of your flight response. So, cold hands and feet are freeze, and warm, clammy hands are flight. And the reason that you start to feel cold when you're in a state of freeze, even when the space that you're in isn't actually cold, is because your body is working really hard to keep you alive. And so your body starts to conserve energy. And the result of that is cold hands and feet. So again, I just covered the more common signs of these survival states, but if you start to break these down a bit and reflect on your day-to-day, you can begin to see where your survival responses are showing up in your life. And I think it's so important to understand these survival responses because oftentimes, if you've been living in survival mode for a long period of time, it can be hard to even recognize that you're living in survival mode. So, for example, when I was living in survival mode, I definitely did not identify as someone who was living in survival mode. I remember I experienced so many of the symptoms of fight, flight, and freeze repeatedly, ongoing. These were ongoing things. And I didn't actually start noticing when I was in these states until I started working with my nervous system directly. I remember at one point, one of my therapists told me that I had difficulty setting boundaries, and I think I was in denial a bit because I didn't see myself as someone who struggled with boundaries, but surely I was. And I think that's also why it's so important to work with someone and not try to do the healing journey alone, because someone else can see your blind spots and gently move you through them. When you're on the healing journey alone and you're not working with anyone, you can't see your blind spots, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be called blind spots. The other thing that I want to mention is tone of voice. So I didn't talk about this specifically with each survival response, but tone of voice is also a reflection of your nervous system and which state your nervous system is in. So I hope that you found this episode helpful. What I hope that you really take from this episode is that all of your thoughts, behaviors, sensations, and emotions reflect the state of your nervous system. If after listening to this episode you still have questions about a symptom, a thought, or behavior that you're experiencing and you're curious to know which state of survival it falls under, just send me a direct message on Instagram and I would absolutely love to answer all of your questions. And if listening to this, you're realizing that your nervous system is functioning from a state of survival and you're ready for more support, send me a message and I would absolutely love to work with you on a deeper level. Like always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you absolutely loved this episode, I would so appreciate it if you subscribed and left a review on Apple Podcast, or take a screenshot and share this episode on social media. Don't forget to tag me at tatiana.holistic.coach. The more nervous systems we reach, the more generational cycles we break, and the more we contribute to a kinder and safer world. And if you're looking for somatic healing services, send me a DM and I'd love to chat on how I can support you. I'll see you in the next episode.